Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today we are going to do standard Keynesian macroeconomic model. This is the same model that was used by Samuelson in the 1960s, and this is more or less the model that I studied in the 70s, but then somehow this model got discarded, and I really don't know what they teach these days, but the models they teach these days are typically based on real business cycles, which is completely a wrong model. So anyway, the model is very simple, something that you should be familiar with. Alright, so I'm just following the chapter 7 of your textbook. Alright, so there are accounting identities and there are behavioral relationships. So far we have been studying accounting, what adds up to what, but today we will be studying behavioral relationships, what causes what. So those are different. What is aggregate demand, how it is determined, and how this leads to an equilibrium outcome in the economy, and the multiplier. And one more topic that is important is the paradox of thrift, which we will also cover, and some comparative statics. So all of these are more or less in this chapter. Some things are not explicitly covered, but alright, so we have studied that C plus I plus G equals Y, or GDP. So the GDP can be broken up into some portion of the product is consumed, some portion of the product is investment, and some portion is goes to the government. Actually, you can also write Y equals C plus I because all of the government production is also is part of the consumption, or it's part of the investment. So if you combine private and public consumption, then you can put both of those into the C term, and you can combine the government investment with the private investment, and then you can put both of those in the I term. So in that case you get Y equals C plus I. And this is an accounting identity. Now the behavioral relationship, that is the key. What determines what? So what we are going to argue is that the demand determines the supply. And so this is called a demand side relationship. That's what the Keynesian model is. And actually there should be a notation. I will actually devise one, inshallah, to show what we're talking about. Anyway, the supply side alternative is that the supply determines the demand, and that is the Say's law. So basically, when Keynes starts his book, he starts directly by saying that Say's law is wrong. And that's exactly the key point which divides Keynesian from the real business cycle. The real business cycle model is a supply side model. Keynesian is a demand side model. So what we are saying here is that the demand determines the supply, but the real business cycle model, which is currently in use in State Bank and all over the world, says that supply determines the demand. How that makes a difference we will see. We have already discussed this many times. So the first thing that happens is that we are going to look at the total expenditure in real terms, because the demand, we say, is a demand for a real goods. It's not a demand for any. I don't say that I'm going to go out and buy 100 rupees worth of stuff. I have in mind some stuff that I want to buy, and whatever the price is, that my objective is specified in real terms, not in nominal terms. What we are going to do is assume that prices are fixed in the short run. And so this means that if there is an imbalance between demand and supply, then the firms will adjust quantities, they will not adjust the prices. And this is one of the things that Keynes also mentions, that in the short run, if the firm sees excess demand, it will produce more goods, and if the firm sees less demand, it will stop producing many goods. So the adjustment takes place in the quantity. This is opposed again to the neoclassical theory of supply and demand, in which if the quantity is, if there is a mismatch between supply and demand, then the price adjusts to eliminate it. So we are not, this is again different. Firms usually have markup pricing, and there is as I said, the microstructure is important because that's what allows us to say this. So what we are saying, and again this is very different from the neoclassical models which are being studied by your batchmates all over the world who are also studying macro. They are taught that the marginal cost varies. The microstructure underneath their macro model is one in which the firm sets marginal cost equal to the competitive price. But here we say that no, firms set prices. Firms have a marginal cost and they set the price to be some sort of a markup over that so that they make some money. Firms usually have constant marginal cost over a large range. So if they see additional demand, they will produce more. Now a competitive firm doesn't do that, because if the competitive firm is making profits, then it will expand production because it's making additional profits. But the firm in our model has a fixed amount of demand, and if it is being satisfied, then it cannot produce more because it cannot sell more goods at that price, although it would be profitable to sell more. So when it sees more demand, it produces more at the same cost because the marginal cost is constant. So firms usually have excess capacity, they can produce more. Sometimes you are at maximum capacity. In that case, if the firm sees excess demand, it will raise prices. The raising of the prices doesn't have to do with price equals marginal cost. It has to do with the fact that by raising prices, it will actually reduce the excess demand because people will go to other firms. But also it wants to raise additional cash in order to build additional capacity to be able to provide. So the reason for the price rise is not due to demand-supply considerations, it's due to additional. Another thing that happens in the real world is what the text calls catalog price, and it's also called menu costs in the literature. It means that you see, the restaurant prints up a menu and the prices are written on it, and so now it can't adjust every day. The price of tomatoes is different every day, but the costs are fixed. So they remain so until you print a new menu, and there is a cost to printing a new menu. So small changes you just live with. And exactly like this, the firms also publish catalogs of products with prices, and then the prices remain fixed until you publish a new catalog. So similarly, actually we saw that in the blinder survey of firms, that firms usually set prices and then they don't change them very often. So the model that we are going to study will describe behavioral relationships. So basically this is just copied from the text, that it's the aggregate demand, which is total spending, that drives the total output, which is the supply, and the total output is produced by employing labor. So the employment is determined by the aggregate demand. The equilibrium level of output need not create full employment. So that is the key Keynesian result, as opposed to the RBC result, which assumes full employment will always happen. So the Keynesian problem, the book was titled The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, something else. So the fact is that what he was trying to say was that employment fluctuates, and so and economists do not have a theory about why employment fluctuates, because economists say that employment will always be at 100%. So that is the main contribution of Keynes. Unfortunately, after 70 years, economists still don't understand what Keynes was saying. And so that's the thing, that there's no full employment guarantee. So full employment has to be achieved by government policy, either fiscal policy or monetary policy. Change in autonomous expenditure. So there are two types of expenditure. There is expenditure which is determined outside of the system, and then there is expenditure which is determined by the level of GNP. Since GNP is an endogenous variable, anything which is determined by Y, or the GNP, is also endogenous. And so that variable, which is endogenous, cannot be changed by us. And this is another thing about which economists have massive amounts of confusion, and they don't clearly differentiate between exogenous and endogenous. They say, what would happen if we change the consumption? Well, you can't change the consumption because consumption is determined by GNP. So talking about changing the consumption is not legitimate, because you cannot change the value of an endogenous variable. You can only change exogenous variables, just logically. So the basic Keynesian model shows us that there is a multiplier effect. If you increase government spending, government spending is usually taken to be exogenous, then the impact on GNP will not be just the amount of the additional demand, but it will actually multiply. And so these are the things that we want to establish. These are your basic baby Keynesian model, which everybody learns in undergraduate economics. But we will have some slightly better understanding. So, how does things happen? Remember that we already did a lecture on this, that you need to talk about sequencing, what happens first, what happens next, and you need to talk about causality, what determines what. So the first thing that happens is that the firms think about what is the expected aggregate demand, and they're trying to plan how much to produce. At the moment, the demand is not visible. The production will take place later in time. And at that time, what the demand will be, they need to anticipate, because they will produce today, but they won't see the demand until later. So they have some expectation about this aggregate demand. So they produce with a target in mind, that this is what we think the demand would be, and then they produce the amount that they think will satisfy the aggregate demand. The production process generates employment, because when you are trying to produce, you hire people, and it generates incomes, because you pay for the factors and you pay for the laborers. Now the aggregate demand is determined by or generated by consumer expenditure, by government expenditure, by investments, by firms and households, and also by the net exports, which is exports minus imports. So the exports is the foreign demand for domestic products that comes into our economy as extra demand, and our imports is the money that our people earn, which is a domestic income, which could have gone into the domestic demand, but instead it is used to purchase foreign goods. So it disappears, it is removed from the domestic demand. So this is one of the leakages from the system. So there's an income generated. This income would be generating demand, but if people use this income to buy foreign goods, and this doesn't contribute to the demand for the domestic production. So now what this says is that the expected aggregate demand drives the production decision. And in equilibrium, the firm will realize their expectation. If the expectation is not realized, then something will change. And that's equilibrium is a situation which persists over time. So basically, GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, this is the consumption which is part of the expected aggregate demand, and this is just a table from the book which shows that the consumption to GDP ratio is around 50% in the OECD countries and doesn't vary all that much, although there are some outliers like Greece, which is a high consumption to GDP ratio, and some places like Luxembourg, which has a low ratio. Now, do you know why Greece has a high consumption ratio and why Luxembourg has a low consumption ratio? These are the two outliers. Greece has 75%, whereas the average is around 50%, and Luxembourg has 32%. Why are these two outliers? Why does Greece have a very high consumption ratio? And why does Luxembourg have a very low ratio of consumption to GDP? In 2010. That's also important. What do you know about Greece's economy? What? Yes, it's a poor country. So, and what about Luxembourg? Luxembourg is the richest country in this. It has the highest GNP per capita in the whole world because it's a very small country. So basic. How's that? The population is low, but that won't matter because this is all per capita terms. That's already given you the answer. If you have low income, then you consume most of it, and if you have a very high income, then you consume a smaller proportion. Alright, so we built our basic model by saying that consumption is, the Keynesian consumption function, consumption is equal to some constant, which is your base level consumption, and then you have a marginal propensity to consume out of disposable income. So disposable income is income minus taxes, which are paid to the government, and then you consume some proportion of that, 50% for example. In addition to that, investment is autonomous expenditure by firms. Now this is an assumption, and this is not completely correct, and there are more complicated models, but for the moment let's just think of this as, so the firms decide on how much to invest in future production capacity, and so they buy capital, they buy houses, machinery, etc. to enhance their productive capacity, and they do this on the basis of their expectations about the future. And one thing that Keynes said is that the expectations about the future are not anchored to reality. The firms may have may be very optimistic about the future, even though the past doesn't have any particular clue about a sudden upturn. So, for example, people might think that CPEC is going to change the economy of the nation, so they might be building investments, and if you look at the data for the past, it might not show any discontinuity, any jump, any reason to expect prosperity. So the investment is autonomous. The aggregate demand is consumption demand, which is determined by the income. So it's an endogenous quantity. Investment is exogenous. Government expenditure we can also take as exogenous for the moment. And then it's exports. Exports is exogenous. It's the outsider's demand for what we produce. Imports is endogenous because how much income we have, we will spend some of it on imports. So we can say that, for simplicity, that the level of imports is a proportion of the level of GNP, some proportion we use for imports. So here we are taking the demand. We are saying that demand, which is the aggregate demand, will determine the level of production. So now the reason, this is a circular relationship because it's a identity, an accounting identity. So we break that up by using the expectations. This is very important, and this is not done in conventional textbooks, which is why students cannot understand. It is confusing because two things that happen simultaneously, each determines the other. So what we say is that the aggregate demand is for the endogenous things like imports and consumption. These are replaced by the expectations, so that you have something in hand. And so once you have an estimate of the aggregate demand, then you make your production decisions. After you make the production decisions, the GNP gets determined. And once the GNP is determined, that determines your consumption and that determines your imports. And now there may not be a balance. So what happens when there is an imbalance? Because so that's what we will cover also. So this is the difference between a model and a fairy tale. The standard macro is a fairy tale because they say, well, let's just pretend that things somehow come into balance. You say, no. A model explains what happens in the world and what happens if there is an imbalance. So that's, unless you describe what happens if there is an imbalance and how this imbalance gets removed, you don't have a model, you have a fairy tale. Alright, so here is the situation. I have sequenced this. Firms anticipate expected demand, which is AD, the aggregate demand. Then the firms produce Y equal to AD, their anticipated aggregate demand. Now, if the production is less than the actual aggregate demand, let's say the expected aggregate demand is Y, which is what the expected value is actually produced, so that becomes Y. Now the real aggregate demand, which is determined by the consumption and the imports, is Y star. Suppose they are different. So the generally speaking, the Y star, which is the actual demand, is the planned expenditure line. The 45-degree line is the actual production. You on the x-axis you have the GDP, and the 45-degree line is the actual GDP. It's just Y equals X. The sloped line is the actual demand based on the production. So if you are at 0, the actual demand is greater because it has some fixed component, and as the GDP increases, the aggregate demand goes up, but not as rapidly because the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. So the aggregate demand has doesn't have slope 1, so it will intersect. So now the initial production can be in any place. It doesn't have to be at the equilibrium. So suppose it's in the zone A, which is the red zone. That means the firms produced something which was less, and the actual demand at that point is high. It's higher than what they produce. So what will happen? That's crucial. What all businesses have inventories. These are used. This is the buffer stock. So now, when the demand is high, they will fulfill it from their inventories, but then they will get the signal that now the demand is higher than what we anticipated. Our inventories are less than what we would like to keep. And so what should we do? We should ramp up the production. We should increase production. Alternatively, if you are in zone B, then you have produced a lot and the demand is not as high. What will happen? Your inventories will start to pile up. And as the inventories become excessive, you say, oh, let's cut back on production because we are not. So by this process, equilibrium will arise. So inventories play a very important role in your quantity adjustment model. They play no role in the price adjustment model. So when you have aggregate demand which is driving the things, then this is how this works. If you have aggregate supply and equilibrium or instantaneous equilibrium, which is what is assumed, then the price immediately adjusts to eliminate any mismatch between supply and demand. And so that's entirely different, and that's the model which is basis of your RBC, real basis the cycle model, which is currently in used, and often mostly macro is being taught around that model. So basically the inventory adjustments is the key to the equilibrium in the Keynesian quantity adjustment model. So inventory can be divided into two parts. Inventory is, one part is planned. We want to keep some inventories around, partly for this buffering purpose and partly because demand fluctuates, so we want to make sure that there is enough to meet random fluctuations in demand. So there's planned inventory and then there's unplanned investment in inventories. Remember that in your GNP figures, the inventory also is part of your investment. So if you have increasing stocks, then you have low aggregate demand, you cut back on production, and similarly. Alright, so the next part is the multiplier process. Suppose that there is an increase in aggregate demand due to an autonomous component. So we can say that there is increase in consumption, but that's not a valid thing to say because consumption is endogenous. We can say that there is increase in government consumption. That's possible. So the government starts purchasing more consumer goods. Since the government decisions are not bound to the GNP, so that's an autonomous component of consumption. Or we can say that the government increases investment, or we can say that the firms increase their investment. That's not directly linked to the current GNP. So it can be exogenous variable. So once there is an increase in the expenditure, then the aggregate demand rises, people start producing more goods, the firms start producing more goods, but when you produce more goods, that generates more income, more employment. So real GDP rises, and so when the income rises, then this leads to additional consumption, and this leads to additional aggregate demand. So this process cycles, and if you repeat a lot of cycles, you get multiple effects. You don't have the first round effect and the second round effect, and ultimately this leads to a multiplier effect. So we can quantify this, and that's what we will do. How much multiplier? So the aggregate demand is G plus I plus this is the autonomous part, G plus I plus C0. C0 is the consumption function, the constant in the consumption function, because that doesn't vary with the GNP. So government investment or consumption, both of these are exogenous. firm private investment is exogenous, exports is exogenous, and C0, the constant in the, these are exogenous. So that's the autonomous portion of the demand. Then there is the endogenous portion, which is the consumption, marginal propensity to consume, C, multiplied by the disposable income. Now, if we think of taxes as just being a fixed proportion of income, then it's 1 minus T. The tax rate is T, so 1 minus T times Y is your disposable income. So basically, that's the portion which is your consumption. And then MY, or the imports, that's also endogenous. So this actually reduces your aggregate demand. So the endogenous portion is this part. So this is actually the multiplier mechanism. If the government increases, the aggregate demand increases, production increases, rising incomes, rising consumption, also a rise in taxes and in imports. Taxes and imports both are leakages from the demand because they reduce the income available to the consumer. So that part cannot be expressed as additional aggregate demand. And so these are called leakages. So if you go into multiple rounds, then suppose taxes are 0, imports are 0, then your multiplier effect is 1 over 1 minus C. 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. We will do this calculation, but that's called the multiplier. 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. If you take into account both taxes and imports, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. It's 1 over 1 minus MPC times 1 minus the tax rate and minus the import rate. Alright, so now let's try to do this on real data. And so, actually I don't have serious models, I'm just doing this last night, so I did it a quick, very crude regression of consumption on GNP. And that's the regression equation that I got. It actually says that the intercept is minus 6.8, E08. We want to use E09, which is millions. So I would multiply that by 10. No. Yeah, it's minus $0.68 million. Constant US dollars. So intercept negative is a little bit strange because means that at zero income you have negative consumption. But the point is that actually this coefficient is not significant. It has a high standard error and a low t statistic and a high p value. So all of this means that this is not significantly different from zero. So we can just assume that this is a statistical fluctuation and set it equal to 0, which is a reasonable possibility. So then the GDP is basically, the consumption function is C is equal to 0.92 times Y for Pakistan, estimated in this very simple way. Let's say that the aggregate demand is consumption plus income plus investment. We subsume the government consumption and government into these categories just to keep things simple. And suppose that the investment is at the level $50 million, which is roughly correct, not much different. All right, so I have now all of the ingredients that I need for my model. I'm assuming exports and imports are out for the moment. We will take that into account later. So closed economy model. So the consumption function is just simple proportion, and the investment is just a flat fixed figure of 50. So now we look at the multiplier. The aggregate demand is AD. It's broken up into exogenous and endogenous. The endogenous part is consumption, which is 0.92 times Y. And the investment is exogenous, which is just 50. The equilibrium occurs when aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. In that case, the expected demand that the firms have will match the actual. So they will keep on producing at the same level in a static economy where nothing is changing. So this is what it means for it to be an equilibrium. If the demand and supply are mismatched, then the firms will have to adjust their production decisions. So at equilibrium, you have to have C plus I equals Y. So what is the equilibrium in this situation? Well, you have 50 is the investment, 0.9 Y is the, I'm rounding 92 to 9 to make it easier to see the calculation. So I have 50 plus 0.9 times Y equals Y. The aggregate demand is 50 plus 0.9 Y, and the aggregate supply is just Y. So if we set these two equal, we get 50, this equation, and by taking 0.9 to the other side, I get 50 equals 0.1 times Y, subtracting 0.9. So I can calculate that Y star, the equilibrium quantity, is 50, the investment, divided by 1 minus MPC, which is 0.1. And 1 over 0.1 is just 10. So 50 gets multiplied by 10, and you have a GNP of $500 billion. So this is the equilibrium, and basically the fixed investment is getting multiplied by the multiplier, which is 10. If you change the investment, suppose I add an additional 10 units of investment, what will happen to the GDP? It will go up by 100 because that is the multiplier. And you can do the same calculation. Its investment is 60, so it's 60 divided by 0.1, which is 60 times 10, 600. So this is the multiplier in action. And if you want to do it in a disequilibrium way, which is actually the better way to understand it, you can say that, all right, people invest 10 additional units of investment. So what happens? The producers see that there is an additional 10 unit of demand. They increase production by 10 units. This 10 units that they increase by generates additional income of 10 for people. And so the people now consume 9 units of that, 90%. And so they actually try to consume 9 units, but they fail because the production is not enough. But they eat up into the inventories, and the firms get the signal that, demand is higher than we thought, and so they ramp up production. And this process keeps repeating because as soon as they ramp up the production, the income increases again, and then this process keeps on repeating. And if you carry it to infinity, you will find that basically it goes to about 10 times the. So 10 units of additional investment leads to 100 units of additional demand. All right. Now we introduce the concept of the potential output. This is a supply side concept. This is the maximum that can be produced using existing factors of production. So let's say that Y, the output, is equal to F of KL, standard production function, depends on capital and labor. And let's suppose the maximum available labor and capital is K star and L star. So the potential output is YP equals F of K star L star. Now in your real business cycle models, they assume that the potential output is always achieved because the capital and labor are always in maximum utilization. Of course, this doesn't match what you see. So what do? They introduce random shocks. They say that, okay, L star can, the amount of labor being used can deviate from its full employment amount by some random amount. So this random shocks, this is basically what Paul Romer is complaining about, that the things that matter are just being, that's what he calls phlogiston. Why did income go down? Oh, there was a random shock. Well, what is this random shock? Nobody knows. So this is leaving the essential elements of the economy unexplained. So basically what we have is that in our Keynesian model, the economy has unutilized capacity. It can expand production because the factors of labor are not fully utilized. So there will be an actual output which is f of KL. K will be less than the total amount of capital and L will be less than the total amount of labor available. So there will be an output gap, which is the potential output minus the actual output. Now the equilibrium output, which we calculated earlier, it can be above or below the potential output. If it is above the potential output, then this leads to inflation. If it's below the potential output, then nothing happens, it's in equilibrium, but the government can choose to take fiscal policy, which involves making investments or adding to consumption, or it can do monetary policy. If the government just pumps in money, then the real income available to the consumers increases, and if the prices are fixed, they will purchase more. If the prices are not fixed, then in your neoclassical models, money is a whale. Suppose the government doubles the amount of money, all the prices double, and there is no change in aggregate demand. So that's the money is a whale and quantity theory model, which doesn't match what we are doing now. So that's why in a Keynesian economy, monetary policy works, because the prices are fixed. When the money is pumped into the economy, the prices remain fixed, so the real income increases, and when the real income increases, the aggregate demand increases, and you can achieve your potential output, which is, the economy is in a recession, because recession means having less output than what you can produce, potential. That's what the meaning of a recession is, having an output gap. So basically the Keynesian theory tells you how to keep your output gap at zero. If the equilibrium output is below potential, then you do fiscal policy and monetary policy to bring it up. If the equilibrium is above above the potential output, then what will happen is that there will be a lot of demand. It cannot be fulfilled, and so the demand will drive up the prices. Alright, now we will look at what is called comparative statics. What happens if some things change? What happens to the... This is one of the favorite exercises in neoclassical economies. So what happens if you change the tax rate? What happens if you change the marginal propensity to consume, etc., if you change the imports? Alright, so one of the very important lessons, and one of the things that very few economists understand today is called the paradox of thrift. So what is this paradox? Well, we know that savings is good. We know that savings is good because C plus I equals Y when you look at the demand side, and when you look at the expenditure account, then the whole income is broken up into some part which is consumed and some part which is saved. So that leads to the key equation, savings equals investments. So the more you save, the more you invest, and the more you invest, the more you add to the productive capacity of the economy. If you have studied your solo growth model, you know that basically the maximum growth is achieved by maximizing saving. The more you save, the more capital you add, the more productive capacity you get in the economy. So ideally you should just consume nothing and invest everything, and you will get the maximum growth. So what it seems, and everybody says that Pakistan has a low savings rate, and it is true. The data shows that and we saw that Greece has a low savings rate in the data, and Luxembourg has a high savings rate. So what should we do? So according to this, what this is telling us, we should encourage the people to save more money. If the people will save more money, then our savings will increase and the investment will increase and we will get more productivity in the future. And in fact, if you look at some economists, like even Mahbub al-Haq in his early phase, he used to think that this is how the economy works. But what the paradox of thrift says is this is not true. If you encourage people to save more, they will end up saving less. This is the standard fallacy of composition. If you encourage people to spend more, they will end up saving more. And this also matches the data. If people are rich, then they save. If people are poor, then they consume. Now, aggregate demand is the driver of the economy. So if people start saving, this will collapse the aggregate demand, this will collapse the production, this will collapse the incomes, and people will not be able to, they will end up saving less. So this is the paradox of thrift. Let's do the calculations. Suppose that C is equal to 0.9y. We have already seen that that leads to a 500 GNP. Now suppose that we run a savings campaign. Pakistan is low in savings. Everybody should save more. And people start saving 20% of their income. So the consumption function becomes C equals 0.8 times y. Now people are saving 20% and spending 80%. So now what happens to the equilibrium income? Previously it was y star equals 50 divided by 0.1, which was 500, and savings was 50, 0.1, 10% of the income. Now at the new consumption function, y star equals 50 over 0.2, 1 minus marginal propensity to consume is now 0.2. That is a multiplier of 5, not 10. So your GDP becomes 250 instead of 500. So the total loss to the economy is $250 million of GDP. But savings doesn't change because savings is 0.2 times 250, which is 50. Why? Because savings has to equal investment. Investment is exogenous and fixed. So regardless of what you do, this is the same thing. The fallacy of composition. Even though people try to save, they will end up saving exactly 50. They will not be able to change the savings, but their attempt to save will lower the aggregate demand. So this is the paradox of thrift. So if people try to spend more, then that will, yes, here is the, suppose we say that, okay, we want to increase savings, so let everybody spend more. This is actually Islamic principle of barakah. You spend on others, and Allah Ta'ala increases the output. So suppose that C goes to 0.95 times Y. People start, we say that, look, Islam says spend. Quran starts with unfiqu. So spend on others, you even go and spend on yourself, spend on your family, spend on others. Don't save. So what will happen? Well, C is equal to 0.95, Y star is equal to 50 divided by 0.05. Now the multiplier becomes 20 instead of 10, and the GDP goes to 1000, it doubles. Savings is still 50 because you're only spending 5% of 1000 because that's fixed at the investment level. It can't change. But the effort to spend more, infaq fi sabilillah, raises the aggregate demand, raises income for everybody. People have better lives. So this is the paradox of thrift. At the individual level, what you try to do has an opposite effect on the aggregate level. Investment is exogenous, so we are not doing two things at once. The investment is fixed at 50. I'm asking about, this is actually how you do comparative statics. When you do comparative statics, you change one thing and you look at the effect of that thing. If you do multiple things, then you cannot isolate cause and effect. So comparative static means that keep all other factors fixed and change this one thing. So if I change the consumption behavior, what happens? So If the consumption behavior becomes spend more, then it leads to rising income. And if the consumer will spend less, it leads to lower income. And that's the paradox of thrift. And the people attempt to save more, they don't end up saving more. All right, what happens with the taxes? That's the comparative statics with tax. So suppose that there used to be zero taxes. Now the government decides to introduce 10% tax rate. So the disposable income is T times Y, which is, this is not disposable, this is the tax. The tax is just 10%. The disposable income is Y minus TY, which is 0.9 times Y. Only 90% of the total GNP reaches the people in the form of income. So now the consumption function becomes 0.9 times 0.9 or 0.81. So the marginal propensity to consume out of income, including the tax rate, is 81%. So 1 minus MPC is 19%, and now the equilibrium will be 50 divided by 0.19, 263. So it used to be 500, so the taxation has substantially cut down the GNP. So taxes is harmful for production and GNP. What is in the Keynesian system, you can change tax to cut down aggregate demand if you are in an inflationary regime. If the aggregate demand is too high, above potential, then you should increase taxes to bring down the aggregate demand to reduce the inflationary impact. Suppose that today what's happening is that the fiscal policy makers using an RBC model are saying that we should increase taxes from 10%. Pakistan has a very low tax rate, which is 10%. We should bring it up to 15%. So what will happen if they succeed? Well, if the tax go to 15%, then C will be 0.9 times 0.85 instead of 0.9. And so that will be 0.765. So the multiplier will be 1 over 0.235, and so this will go to 212. So basically aggregate demand will be reduced by 51 million US dollars, and so it would be a very harmful measure to try to increase taxes. So it's a separate question, why IMF insists on increasing taxes and why our government also agrees with this. Alright, now suppose we run a Be Pakistani, Buy Pakistani campaign. What would happen? Well, now I have to put in the exports and imports, and so I say aggregate demand is C plus I plus X minus M. Let's consider now that I plus X is 50. So the aggregate autonomous demand is 50. Previously I had taken X out of the picture, but I can put X back in. It's an exogenous component, and I can say, okay, let's think that 40 was investment and 10 is the demand for our products from outside. Now suppose that C is 0.9Y as usual, and now the imports, suppose that they are at 10% of the income. So now what we have initially is that the aggregate demand is 50 plus 0.9Y minus 0.1Y now, because that's the import leakage. So we have the demand which comes out of income is now only 0.8, even though the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. 0.1 portion of it goes to the additional, to the imports, so that doesn't hit domestic aggregate demand. So then the equilibrium will be 50 over 1 minus 0.8, which is 50 over 0.2. The multiplier is now 5, and so the aggregate income will be 250. So now suppose we run a Be Pakistani, Buy Pakistani campaign, and from 10% we reduce the marginal propensity to import out of income to 0.05. So previously, people were buying imports from 10% of the income. Now they are only buying using 5% of their income. So 5% comes back into the domestic economy. So now we have 50 plus 0.9y minus, instead of 0.1, 0.05. So this becomes 0.85 instead of 0.80. And now the y star is 50 over 0.15, which is the 1 minus 0.85. And if you calculate, this comes out to 333. And so basically we have increased from 250 to 333. So it's a huge impact, even though it's a small change in the marginal propensity to consume. This has a massive impact on the aggregate demand, and your aggregate demand increases. So these are all, this is all the basic comparative statics. What's the effect of changes in marginal propensity to consume? What's the effect of changes in autonomous expenditure? What's the effect of taxes? What's the effect of imports? So that's all for today. What I would like to do, now these are not numbers, these are not toy models that we are playing with. When I sit at the marginal propensity, at the Monetary Policy Committee, which will be taking place in a week or two, we calculate what is the aggregate demand, we use a consumption function, and we ask the question, is what should the rate of interest be so that the demand is not higher than the potential output, because if the demand is higher than the potential output, then this will lead to inflation in the economy. So we have to do these calculations. David Henry is a famous econometrician, and he's used, his model is used in the Monetary Policy Committee of England. He has written a paper about how it cost £1 million or a large number to the English economy, to the British economy, because basically they asked him for a forecast. They used the model for a forecast, and actually the model was predicting fairly high aggregate demand, which meant that you should have a tight monetary policy. You should cut, and you should increase interest rates and lower the money supply. And so they did that, but the aggregate demand, the model was actually mistaken about the aggregate demand, and this led, instead of bringing the aggregate demand down to the full employment level, it actually caused a recession in the economy, which led to a multi-million-dollar loss. So having good estimates of your aggregate demand is a matter of practical relevance. Now what I made was a toy model of the consumption function, and I am thinking that next lecture we will try to give you some econometric theory about the consumption function, how we actually estimate real consumption functions, which involves some more thought.